So today is October 31st, and AMD has just announced its new 9800 X3D Ryzen 7 processor. This is the first of the Zen 5 processors with integrated 3D V-cache, something that people have been requesting for a while because next generation gaming performance always seems to work very well with the stacked V-cache design. Now, reviews aren't going live for at least another week. It goes on retail on November 7th at a price of, I think, $429 or $459 with 8 cores, 16 threads. You get the gist. There's a few things different, however, with this design compared to previous designs and compared to some of the rest of the industry. And it's all about how we stack those chiplets. Based on the diagrams that AMD have put out on their Twitter feed, and during presentations from Jack Hune, who SVP at AMD, this time around, it looks like that the compute die is on top and the cache die is underneath, which is a reversal of what it was in the previous generations. And I want to go through the pros and cons of doing it each way with you. What's your minimum specification? So the 3D V-cache concept is a form of hybrid integration, hybrid bonding, where the whole point is, rather than putting two chips side by side, if you can put them on top of each other, then the distance for any data to travel between the chips is very, very small. You can take power benefits and you can take latency benefits. The idea here with AMD's chips is that they have a L3 cache chiplet such that it allows them to expand the L3 count. You have to build this into the design because this compute chiplet goes into a number of other different products as well. So you have to build it with V-cache in mind, whether you use it or not. And when V-cache was first announced a couple of generations ago, especially in the enterprise processors, for example, we noticed in the BIOS of those systems, it had an option that said, cache 1 high, 2 high, 4 high, 8 high, suggesting that this is a technology that could extend beyond simply having one cache chiplet connected. You could have 2, 4, or 8. The problem therein is that you have to build for the power, you have to build for the data, and having those through silicon vias or TSVs in that design, you have to balance what's data, what's power, and how you manage it. Now, I'm going to have a few metrics that we're going to judge whether putting the new way of what AMD is doing with the compute die on top makes sense or not. And the first metric we have to think about is thermals. Now, in this design where you've got a compute die and a cache die, the compute die is the one that's consuming the most power. That's got the cores on it. That's going to be doing the logic, whereas the cache die is just simply SRAM. It's for data access and retrieval. As a result, you need the compute die to be as cool as possible in order to help drive up the frequency and get all the benefits of lower thermal running. By having it on the top of that stack, that gives it direct access, or at least the most direct access, to any cooling put on top of the chiplet. So you've got your integrated heat spreader, you've got your thermal interface material inside the chip, and then you've got whatever cooling you put on top, or whether you liquid cool. And by having the compute die on the top, that gives it the best access to thermal dissipation. These chiplets do have an ideal working window, and if you contain a chip, especially a high power chip, and surround it with other silicon such that it can't get the thermals out easily, you could arguably distort the thermal environment for that chiplet, and as a result you get lower performance. So by having the cache chiplet underneath and the core chiplet on top, the one that's drawing the most power, this is the biggest benefit to this design. You get to dissipate all that thermals, all the energy that's being built up, that's creating those thermals, and you can cool it more efficiently. So in this column, I'm going to give a big plus plus to having a compute die on top versus underneath. When it's underneath, any thermal environment has to go through the cache chiplet. As a result, you're warming the cache chiplet up, and you have to still try and pull away the heat energy from that system. But you've got this added interface. There's more silicon, there's hybrid bonding, And the thermal interfaces there are not continuous, and they may be not in the using ideal materials for thermal conduction. So putting the core chiplet underneath has that effect of you're limiting the environment. This may be one of the reasons why the new processor from AMD is overclockable, because you can now deal with the core thermals appropriately. That's not to say when the core chiplet is above on top that the cache chiplet doesn't experience thermals. It still does. However, what you've got is the thermals of what's generating all that energy can now dissipate all that heat away. The second element I'm going to put up here is complexity. Now, when you're designing these chiplets, whether it's a compute die or a cache die, you have to make sure all the through silicon vias, that you have enough of them that they're either carrying power or data and they're not interfering with each other. With a compute die on the bottom, because that's what's consuming the most power, you can directly bring all the power and all the data up from the main socket, from the system, and deliver it directly to that die. And then with the cache die underneath, because the cache die is consuming less power, you don't need as many power vias, but you still need all the data vias in order to transfer the data. However, it's less complex going from die to die. When you put the compute chiplet on top, there is additional complexity here because you still have to power that top compute die. That means you need to bring all the power from the socket through the cache chiplet and into the compute die at the top. That's going to interfere with signaling, data integrity, and that in of itself is going to have feedback into the power integrity as well. You need to manage any additional V-droops you have by going through multiple layers in that system when you have the compute die on top. And it does make the design of the cache chiplet a lot more complex because it has to deal with that power. Now, I'm not saying it's overly difficult to deal with that. I'm just saying you have to design around it. When you have the core chiplet underneath, then it essentially minimizes the additional connectivity you need between the chiplets. So you have to design that in. As a result here, I'm going to put a plus on having the compute die on the bottom because this is an important part of the design. And next we move on to stacking. This is the ability to put more than one cache chiplet into your stack. If you've got the compute die on the bottom, and you can continuously add in extra cache chiplets on top. The downside is you have to deal with the thermal environment of having more silicon on top and more vias. However, by having the cache chiplets on top, you only need to bring up the vias to power the chiplets. Whereas if you had it the reverse way round, which is what's currently in AMD's system, you have to bring the power for the core chiplet up all the way through the stack if you were doing a multi-cache chiplet design. If we look at things like HBM, which is something I'll get onto in a bit, especially moving on to next generation HBM, HBM4, you have a compute die, and then the memory chiplets are stacked on top. The reason they do this is because it's more power efficient, and the thermal environment of the compute chiplet at the bottom isn't adversely affected by having multiple sets of HBM. Now, these are going to go 8 high or even 12 high next generation to deal with that. It's because I guess in this situation, when we're talking about a core die and cache chiplets on top, the core die is just pulling way more power than a HBM die would. But as a result, when you're doing multiple stacking, arguably it makes sense to have the compute die at the bottom for complexity. You have to deal with the thermals though. So I'm going to put a plus in the box for the compute die at the bottom for this one. Next, let's go on to latency. One of the arguments of having additional cache chiplets is that you're extending your L3 region, and that helps reduce latency for things like gaming that can be L3 cache sensitive when dealing with the GPU. The point is the data has to go into the core first. The core then accesses the cache back to the core, and then the core deals what it has to do by going to the PCIe controller and then out to the GPU. Also, in this instance, also the memory controller, for example, you have to go from the core die through the memory controller out to main DRAM. When you have the compute die on the bottom and your amount of L3 access is low, you arguably don't need to use any chiplets stacked on top of it. So that way you're minimizing access and the amount that data has to transfer in order to do that. When you've got the compute die at the top, it changes this paradigm. Everything has to go through that cache die, through the data vias, through the power vias, from the socket to the top compute die. That adds distance, and it has to go across multiple hybrid bonding, hybrid integration, micro bumps in order to do that, which increases power, it increases time, and ultimately this will have a knock-on effect on latency. The idea is that having more L3 cache kind of like hides it overall, or the fact that you've got the compute die on top means that you can manage the thermals better, which means you can push the frequency higher. So I guess the downside on this is latency may overall be higher on a clock by clock basis, but in terms of a nanosecond by nanosecond basis, you may actually be lower due to the increased, just due to the better thermal environment. It doesn't mean you're less efficient, but that's, a different argument altogether. In this case, for latency, I'm going to put another plus in having the compute die on the bottom rather than on the top. And by extension, I'm going to also extrapolate that to power, just simply because your power is determined by how many boundaries you have to cross and how many chiplets you have to go through. So when you have the compute die on the bottom, you're only going into the compute die and then maybe the cache chiplet if you need to. With the compute die on top, you have to go through all the cache chiplets, as I mentioned before, and that's going to increase your power consumption. That means that there will be some thermals in the middle of that stack you have to deal with, but the main thermals will still be in the compute die. Now, we may be simply talking microwatts here. However, in some circumstances, every little helps in that regard. Now let's talk about sizing, because when AMD first launched their cache chiplet design, you had the compute die on the bottom, the cache chiplet on the top, and the cache chiplet was smaller than the compute die, so they had to put essentially additional stiffeners to make it flat to help with the cooling. When you have the compute die on the bottom, you can size your cache chiplet essentially how you want. There are new packaging technologies coming down the road, such as Intel's OmniDirect, where it doesn't matter how big or small either of the compute dies are, because through their technology, you can put all the power and all the data vias that you need essentially through a middle layer. When you have the compute die on top, right now, it makes sense to have the cache chiplet, the one that's underneath, match the size, to the micrometer or even nanometer, because you need all the connections, all the TSVs between the chiplets to be sufficient, and you don't need any overhang, but you also need better thermal performance. And when you start thinking about multiple stacked chiplets, now, you could argue that there could be stiffeners inside underneath as well. And yes, that's true. Though that makes it more complex when it comes to packaging. And so this kind of rolls into the same thing. With packaging, you're talking about connecting two chiplets together, whether it's a compute and a cache or a cache and a compute, and you need to align all the connectivity bonds, all the hybrid bonds there within a certain tolerance. You have to do it within a certain tolerance. And if you go, more than say 9 microns one side or the other, last generation it was 9 micron technology, then you suddenly don't have a connection. And the more you're offset by, arguably the more resistance you introduce into that system. So by having cache chiplets on the bottom, you have to manage that with the socket as well as the compute die, and it's the compute die that ultimately makes or breaks whether the product works. When you're dealing with multiple stack chiplets, that only increases the problem if you're having the compute die on top. This is another one of those instances where if you have the compute die on the bottom, it just makes everything simpler with regards to power, signaling, packaging going forward. And again, that's one of the reasons why HBM does this. So again, it's another plus for having the compute die on the bottom. And if we look at all the metrics that I've discussed today in this video, you can see that pretty much every situation favors having the compute die on the bottom rather than the top, except one, and that's the thermals. If your goal is peak frequency at all costs, regardless of the increased complexity, regardless of the increased packaging, regardless of the slightly increased power consumption that may be involved, and even some of the latency that you may be able to hide with frequency and thermals trumps all. And that's kind of what AMD is going on here. Now, if we look at the industry and see what's been going on with regards to stacking, right now we're talking about hybrid bonding, hybrid integration, micro bumps on top of each other. Having C4 bumps connecting things together has happened in the past. For example, we get a compute die on the top of an interposer. An interposer in this case is more like a dumb routing layer, usually built in 65 nanometer or whatever. And the only thing it has to do is bring power and data vias from the socket to the chiplets on top of it. And we've seen that in GPUs, we've seen that in a variety of AI chips and what have you. But that works because the interposer layer isn't doing anything. All it is a mechanism to help improve performance when two chiplets are talking to each other. Maybe that's a compute and a HBM, or a compute and a compute. An EMIB also does this, but it actually embeds the interposer into the package in a very small specific area. So that already exists in the market quite extensively. However, there are other packaging technologies like TSMC Info and POP, which talk about integrating DRAM packages on top of a CPU, like in a smartphone. Now you're probably thinking, well, hang on a second, a smartphone SoC, I think I've got some up here. This is Snapdragon 8 Gen 1. It looks a bit like this. What you have is you have the package, you have the chip, you have the substrate, which is the the green stuff. Then you have the silicon chip on top, and then you put DRAM on top of that. But the thing is, the DRAM isn't directly bonded to your SoC. It actually has connectivity vias outside of the SoC that go through the package. As a result, you now have essentially DRAM on top of compute, which brings to the thermals issue. We have by having a compute die underneath. However, in these type of systems that are pulling 5-7 watts on 100 square millimeters, it's not affecting it enough for some serious downclocking. And I know we've all had phones that get hot over time. That's more just due to the thermals of the phone. POP packaging, info packaging works because it allows you to put the DRAM inside the system rather than having it as a separate item on the PCB. So that makes sense there. Alongside that, we've got AMD's new chips doing it, compute on top. We've got AMD's old X3 chips doing compute on the bottom. One thing I mentioned here is HBM. Now, HBM is essentially, stacked high bandwidth memory. In the industry with HBM2, HBM3, and upcoming HBM4, we typically talk about having 2 high, 4 high, 8 high, and then moving up to 12 high. And the whole point here is that you've got your data cells connected to each other in these stacks, and you need some way of controlling that. With HBM2 and HBM3, that control was essentially provided by the memory controller. And it went out into an interposer, and the interposer had the stacked cache on top, and you dealt with it that way. With HBM4, that changes. You have to have a compute die as part of the stack to do some of the management. So it's taking some of the complexity away from the memory controller on the ASIC, on the chip, and moving it to the HBM stack itself. That means power goes that way, and you still have to deal with the thermals. When I was speaking with SK Hynix at TSMC's OAP conference in September, they were talking about how they have to work with TSMC in order to build that chiplet, that control chiplet underneath that's doing that control, that's consuming the compute style power, but also make sure that their HBM on top still performs in the right thermal environment, still performs with the right power. They don't experience things like a voltage drop when the memory controller is sending lots of requests through the package to their essentially what is a compute die. Talking to them, I didn't ask them directly, but that's a sort of environment where compute die on top wouldn't really work, because then all your commands have to go up to the compute die at the top. It has to then reach down into the stack to read the data. That data has to come all the way back up to the top, to the compute die to be managed, and then sent all the way down back into the ASIC to essentially deal with whatever data needs to be done. That's why if you look at AMD's new design with the compute chiplet on top, and I talk about latency, there's additional elements here that add to that potential latency. And you still have to deal with the thermals within the cache chiplet themselves, whether you're talking about, in this instance, AMD, or whether you're talking about HBM. Recently, actually, we just learned that Grok's new chip, Grok being an AI company that to date has an LPU, they call it an LPU for large language model processing, which is built on GlobalFoundries 12, 14 nanometer. Their next generation stuff will be on Samsung SF4X. They announced that earlier this year, but it's also come to light that they will also be looking at stacked SRAM for their chip. Right now, I've spoken about smartphone, HBM, and AMD's chiplets that are all about anywhere from 70 square millimeters to 100 square millimeters. If we think about AI chips, we typically think about big silicon, maybe 600-800 square mil. I can imagine Jonathan Ross, the CEO of Grok, doing something as crazy as 800 square millimeters of SRAM on top of their chip. Again, they have to deal with the thermals on that. They have to deal with there's additional stacks, and whether it's compute on top or compute on bottom. I would put money that it's compute on bottom. We'll have to wait and see. It's an interesting design choice for AMD if that is exactly what they're doing. We'll find out in a week when reviews come live and people start dealing in this stuff and etching away and see what's going on. It definitely makes sense from a thermal perspective, right? When you've got such a heat generating device on top of that stack and you need to remove the thermal energy out of the system, you need to be as close to where it's generated as possible to get the best cooling in there as possible. If it's underneath the cache chiplet, then you're going to have a hard time. And I think it's because of that way they've been able to open up overclocking for this generation. We'll see how that extends to what exactly can be overclocked and where, and what's managed in that system. No doubt we'll all see reviews on day one when it goes live. However, I think longer term, if they're looking at doing higher density or multiple chiplets on any design, compute on top is perhaps not the way to go. We did learn at their event, Advancing AI event, last month, that the EPYC platform, the new 5th gen Turin, EPYC 9005 series, there won't be a Turin X, as in one with 3D V-cache, simply because the market's just had 2 generations of EPYC with V-cache, and the markets that want V-cache aren't necessarily the ones that are updating every cycle. So they're basically saying it's the right product at the right time. And as of right now, there are no plans to do, say, a Turin Zen 5 with V-cache for enterprise, but they are definitely doing it in consumer, and they're doing it this way. Given the fact that, back in the first generation of V-cache, back at the start of the video, I said we saw in the BIOS 1 high, 2 high, 4 high, 8 high. We never saw that productized. I wonder if that's coming. And I think that would be really interesting to see, especially to see what workloads work best in that sort of environment. If you like this content, there are multiple ways to support the channel. You can like and subscribe this video, and many thanks for doing so. There's also Patreon, which gives you access to our Discord. There's a merchandise store and a newsletter, links in the description. For all of you who do contribute, thank you. You are keeping me well fed.